Amelia Earhart was an internationally famous aviation pioneer and perhaps the best-known female pilot of all time. But in July of 1937, she disappeared over the Pacific Ocean while attempting to become the first female flyer to circumnavigate the globe. Her disappearance remains a mystery to this day, and has only amplified her place in history. But there was another aviatrix who suffered a similar fate, and yet her name is virtually forgotten. And that woman was Gladys Faber. Gladys Faber was born on the 9th of August, 1904, in Vancouver, Canada. Her mother had died in childbirth, and Gladys was raised by her father Silas, who owned a prominent hardware store. Gladys once commented that her father essentially raised her as a boy, even going so far as to make her wear a fake mustache. Young Gladys was a self-described tomboy who enjoyed climbing trees, swimming, and boxing, often competing against larger, older male opponents. Her father encouraged these traditionally masculine pursuits and even arranged for her to wrestle a large bear. However, as Gladys began to blossom into womanhood, she began to attract the attention of various male admirers, one of whom she met at her father's store, who would soon change the course of her life in dramatic fashion. Dave Hornicutt Johnson was a traveling salesman from Saskatchewan who convinced young Gladys to run away with him and seek a more glamorous life in the big city. Johnson had a dream of being on the stage, but no particular talents that stood out, so they traveled the vaudeville circuit, performing variously as a magician and his assistant, a pair of jugglers, and a song and dance team. Unfortunately, none of these acts proved to be too popular, given their complete lack of training or experience, and soon Dave gave up his show business dreams and went back on the road as a traveling salesman, leaving Gladys stranded in Peoria, Illinois, where she found work at the local alfresco amusement park. After a short stay there, Gladys moved to Chicago and finally found the glamorous big city life she had been promised. The Roaring Twenties had begun, and Gladys found herself immersed in a world of booze, jazz, and sexually liberated women known as flappers. For the former tomboy from Vancouver, it was refreshing to be considered both an attractive young woman and the equal of any man. She smoked, drank, and learned how to drive a car, all things that would have been considered unladylike just a short time ago. It was in Chicago that Gladys attended an air show and met daredevil pilot Johnny Bradford, who gave her her first ride in an airplane and introduced her to the extremely dangerous occupation of wing walking. For many people, it would have been a terrifying concept to climb out on the wing of an airplane in flight. But for the girl who had grown up wrestling grizzly bears, it was just another adventure. Soon, Gladys and Johnny were barnstorming the country, performing their acts of aerial acrobatics to delighted and astonished crowds, who were entranced by both Johnny's stunt flying and by the attractive young woman who seemed to have no fear of danger in the face of her death-defying antics in midair. Both Gladys and Johnny enjoyed an active nightlife, and they sought out the local speakeasy in whatever town they happened to be in. Unfortunately, Johnny started to drink so heavily that he began to fly while intoxicated, making it difficult to maintain control of the airplane and putting Gladys at even greater risk than usual. It was on one fateful performance that Johnny was so drunk that he passed out, causing the plane to begin plummeting to the ground. Gladys quickly climbed into the co-pilot's seat and despite having never flown an airplane before, managed to bring the craft to a partially successful crash landing. Gladys survived, but was hospitalized for a time. But tragically, Johnny perished in the accident. The story of the flying flapper who had cheated death caused a minor sensation at the time, and when Gladys had recovered from her injuries, she was approached by a man known as Mickey the Weasel Cranston, who had an unusual proposition for her. Cranston was looking for a female pilot to fly cargo from Mexico to El Paso, Texas, and offered Gladys both a considerable salary and the opportunity to fly her own airplane. Of course, Gladys had no experience in the cockpit, save for one semi-successful emergency landing, but a lack of experience had never deterred Gladys in the past, so she accepted the job without hesitation. As it turned out, the cargo in question was a supply of bootleg liquor, a detail which Cranston had failed to mention in his offer of employment. As it happened, women often proved to be the most successful bootleggers during the Prohibition era, as they were generally considered above suspicion, and the police were prohibited from searching female subjects in many jurisdictions, making it easy for a woman to conceal contraband liquor on her person. Gladys had no particular moral qualms about the illegal nature of the activity, and was thoroughly in love with the experience of flight, so she continued making the illicit cargo runs, until Mickey the Weasel Cranston was gunned down by a rival bootlegger, leaving her unemployed, but in possession of her own aircraft. In addition to Amelia Earhart, there were a number of other female pilots of the day, but their opportunities were often limited. There was Bessie Coleman, one of the first African-American female pilots, who had to move to France to get her license because no U.S. school would accept her. Although Harriet Quimby, the first woman to fly across the English Channel, had a lucrative career, and even became the logo of the Vin Fizz sparkling grape drink before her untimely death at the age of 37 in a tragic air accident. For Gladys, the future was unclear. Johnny had always managed their bookings and business arrangements, and her previous flying experience consisted entirely of bootlegging. For a time, she found employment in the relatively new enterprise of crop dusting, but found the work tedious and lacking in adventure. As the decade came to an end, and the stock market crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression, Gladys found that her flying opportunities were becoming scarce, and she didn't have the money to maintain her aircraft, let alone replace it with a more modern model. Tired of her life in the rural backwoods, she sold her plane and moved to New York City, where she hoped that her fortunes would somehow improve. Having had some experience on the stage, Gladys attempted to find work as a Broadway chorus girl. But dancing had never been her strong suit, and she had no luck finding employment on the Great White Way. Although she failed to land a job in the theater, she applied herself to a different kind of dancing, entering in various dance marathons. Dance marathons were a phenomenon that flourished during the Depression, as they provided contestants with food, shelter, and a chance for cash prizes. Participants would have to remain on their feet around the clock, getting only short breaks to eat or sleep for a few minutes. These marathons could go on for weeks or even months. Gladys, having always been in excellent physical condition, managed to parlay success in several of these hellish dance-a-thons to raise enough money to purchase a used aircraft that was a definite improvement over her old model, but in need of some repairs. Having enjoyed some success in competitive dancing, Gladys attempted to do the same thing with her flying. There were numerous air races and long-distance competitions. However, many of those were closed to women, and virtually all of them had strict requirements for entrance that Gladys would have difficulty meeting. Gladys had never concerned herself with credentials or formal training, and simply tried her hand at whatever the situation called for. For a time she reverted to her youthful experience posing as a man that her father Silas had impressed upon her, hoping that she would have more opportunities as a male pilot named Dennis McGuffrey, but her awkward attempts at this deception were largely unsuccessful. While bootlegging liquor from Mexico to Texas, Gladys had made the acquaintance of a rather shady character known as Juan Jose Sandoval, a respectable businessman on the surface, but one with many ties to illicit activities of all kinds. With Prohibition having ended in 1933, there was no opportunity to resume the lucrative rum-running trade. But Gladys contacted Sandoval and convinced him to sponsor her in aerial competitions in Latin America, where the entry requirements were more lax, and a few well-placed bribes could potentially open doors for the ambitious female flyer. Sandoval was intrigued by the idea and agreed to help her, although his motives were not entirely clear. It has been rumored that there may have been a clandestine affair between the two, but very little is known about the true nature of their relationship. With Sandoval's help, Gladys was able to compete in a few lesser-known flying competitions, but her lack of experience and generally deficient skills as a pilot often resulted in disappointing conclusions. Her substandard aircraft also made it exceedingly unlikely that she would prevail in any sort of race that involved speed. But once again, Gladys drew inspiration from her dance marathon days and decided that if she couldn't be the fastest female pilot, she could be the best at long-distance flying. In 1936, she attempted to become the first woman to circumnavigate the planet, a full year before Amelia Earhart attempted the daring feat. With Sandoval's backing, she was able to acquire a somewhat more suitable plane for the task, but in her usual seat-of-the-pants fashion, she really had no idea how to accomplish such a lofty undertaking, and was ill-prepared for the journey. For some reason, she chose to fly a polar route, traveling north-south instead of the more conventional east-west flight plan employed by others, such as Wiley Post, who was the first pilot to fly solo around the globe in 1933, traveling from New York to Berlin, then on to the Soviet Union, and returning to New York in 7 days, 18 hours, and 49 minutes. On the 14th of September, 1936, Gladys departed Guadalajara, Mexico, with little fanfare, and flew south, hoping to reach Buenos Aires, Argentina, before making the trek over the South Pole. It was the last time anyone ever heard from Gladys Faber, as her poorly planned and underfunded expedition had failed to provide her plane with a radio, relying instead on carrier pigeons, which were just birds that had been captured in a local park and never trained to deliver messages. At the time, there were rumored sightings that claimed that she had veered wildly off course and was spotted crossing the Panama Canal, or one report that wreckage of a similar plane had been discovered in the Andes Mountains, but no verifiable trace of the pilot has ever been found. Like Amelia Earhart, the disappearance of Gladys Faber has remained one of the great mysteries of aviation for decades, although it has hardly sparked the same kind of interest. Gladys Faber was many things in her time, although she rarely mastered any of them. But for pure daring and audacity, she has few rivals. The fact that she survived for 32 years is a remarkable achievement in and of itself, and she died as she lived, reckless, ill-prepared, and thirsting for adventure. For the young girl from Vancouver, there was simply no other way to live.